and a very warm welcome to this EPC update, our regular look at key developments in and around the European Union. My name is Jacki Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the EPC, and with me this week, as always, are Fabian Zuleeg, Chief Executive and Chief Economist at the EPC, and Janis Emmanouilidis, Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Studies. And delighted to welcome our special guest today. She's back, Amanda Paul, Senior Policy Analyst at the EPC. As we're going to discuss this morning, two closely interlinked issues which are at the focus of debate in the European Union right now, namely the prospects for internal EU reform and the prospects for enlargement. As always, a totally interactive session, questions from me to our panel, and I hope later on from all of you. If you want to ask a question, as always, two ways to do it. You can click on the raised hands button and I will unmute your microphone and ask you to do the same when the time comes, or you click on the Q&A button, and my usual plea to be as brief as possible, whether asking your question in writing or orally, so we can squeeze in as many as possible. So let us get underway. And part of the inspiration for our discussion today came from a speech that the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz made to the European Parliament on Europe Day on May the 9th, when he said that Europe would have to change, as he put it, if it was to secure a favourable position for Europe in tomorrow's world. And he called for a, and I quote, geopolitical, expanded, reformed EU. So, Fabian, what did you make of the speech overall, and how significant was it? Both, let's touch briefly on the two issues we're going to focus on later on, both in terms of that debate post-conference on the future of Europe, as we look at the prospects for enlargement, that debate on whether this is the moment for internal EU reform, and indeed on the prospects for enlargement, particularly in the context of the war in Ukraine. How significant was this speech? Did it mark a change? Did it mark Germany taking leadership on this issue?
Well, firstly, I want to start with a positive. I think it's very good that there's a recognition in the German government at the highest level that things have to change, that reforms are necessary, that a different approach is necessary. I think Scholz gave his Zeitenwende speech very soon after the invasion. I think this is a similar kind of speech where he's signaling about some of the European changes which are necessary. But I think the real question will be, what will this lead to? What are we going to see in terms of concrete changes, concrete proposals? How much political will, how much political commitment and investment is there going to be to push this forward? How much cooperation is there with other EU countries? Clearly, Germany cannot decide alone. So there has to be a broader alliance which pushes this forward and which is willing to tackle some of the taboos in a very concrete way. Not to say in a very general way, for example, we all know that decision-making has to change. No, but we need to know exactly what are we going to propose? How is that going to be put through? How are we going to deal with those countries who are not going to be going along? And I think what all of this underlines is something we have already noted many times during the update, is that there's a lack of strategic thinking. There's a lack of that strategic discussion which says, where do we want to go? What are we needing to achieve over the next years? And then we can start talking about how do we concretely translate that into reality.
Okay, let's come back on those issues, and specifically when you talk about political will, investment, particularly I think in relation to the enlargement debate and indeed the reform debate and the leadership required to get somewhere with it. But Janis, your overall assessment, how significant was this speech, and does it reflect, do you think, the mood across the EU on these two issues?
Well, first of all, I think if you go back over the past 1 year, 3 months, you had the Zeitenwende speech, which I think was the most important speech he gave on the issue. He gave the speech in Prague. He now gave the speech on the 9th of May in the European Parliament. But the two latter, both the speeches in Prague and the speech also in the European Parliament, did not deserve a lot of attention. They were not really discussed. They were not taken up. Also, if you look into media coverage in Germany, there was not a strong coverage in his own home country with respect to the speech. But if you look into the speech itself, I think it is first of all, it's important to have these kinds of debates and to link the different strategic issues with each other. So geopolitics, enlargement, reform, because these things are so closely interlinked with each other that they need to be discussed also jointly in order to then think of what Fabian was talking about, the need to set strategic objectives in terms of how to then achieve the aims which you have in a general formulated. Also, if you look into the speech concretely, and I think that's a passage which is probably one of the most important ones, where he's linking the larger Europe also to the watershed moment. And he said that it is a question of enduringly safeguarding peace in Europe following the Zeitenwende. So enlargement is inherently linked to the need to reform the EU and to the future geopolitical role of the EU. And that's exactly right. The question then is of, one, how much political capital one is ready to invest, as Fabian was already alluding to. And here, I think the signals from Berlin are that, one, we are very much tied up with dealing with ourselves. The coalition government is not in a very good shape. So it's a very much introverted focus in the day-to-day debate in Germany, rather than looking at the broader European strategic positioning. And the second thing is, what's the overall mood among the EU 27? And my diagnosis is that when it comes to reforms, there is not that much of an appetite to actually move things forward. So you need that leadership. And that's going back to the previous point. There's the question of, how much actually Scholz and the government in Berlin will be ready to politically invest into this.
And he did say in his speech that he would continue, as he put it, his efforts to convince people to make the necessary reforms. Come back on what that means and what he would have to do later on. But Amanda, focusing now on the expanded bit of that, we'll come back on the enlargement issue and how it relates to the EU's geopolitical ambitions a bit later. But what was your overall assessment of what he said on enlargement? And he was talking about an honest policy. He said we need an honest enlargement policy. What do you think he meant by an honest policy, and does the EU have one now?
I mean, I'm hoping that he meant that there would be a new momentum put into the enlargement policy, that words are actually going to be transformed into concrete actions, and that the processes that are already underway in the Western Balkans will be speeded up, and that the commitments that have been made now to Ukraine, Moldova, and to Georgia will actually move forward. I mean, subject to them meeting the relevant priorities, but that they weren't just, promises on paper. Because if we look back over at least the last, 15 to 20 years, I would say there has been a very dishonest enlargement policy. I mean, how is it that it took 20 years for North Macedonia to open accession negotiations? I mean, if we go back to the Thessaloniki summit all those years ago, I mean, it was supposed to be a top priority to integrate the Western Balkans into the EU, and we've seen nothing of the kind. We've actually seen the opposite. We've seen the politicization of the process, individual member states blocking the process, which has hindered not only the countries, but the broader region in terms of their stability and security. And also, of course, if we look at the Turkish case, I mean, nobody wants to talk about Turkey, but the fact is that long before democratic backtracking started in Turkey, the process of accession was derailed actually by individual member states, by France, Germany, Cyprus, and some others. So I think there needs to be a complete sort of revolution in the way that enlargement policy is to actually function, that it actually works and it delivers for the countries that are in the process, because it's very frustrating for those countries who are held back.
Thank you very much. And I want to come back on Turkey. I want to come back on whether we have that momentum you talked about. Amanda there saying, Janis, that she hoped Honest means living up to your promises. Honest could also mean telling countries waiting to join what they would see as the EU would see as hard truths about how long it will take. What's your interpretation of what he meant when he said it? You're muted, Midir.
Excuse me for that. I think that on the one hand, yes, there is the question of realism, and one needs to be honest in this debate. When you talk to colleagues and friends in Ukraine, they will tell you how important the perspective of joining the EU is for them. And you sometimes get the impression that they feel that this could be become a reality in a rather short period of time. And I think that one needs to be honest in this debate that this is not a period of, even when some say months, that it's obviously not about months, that it will take years. The question is that one is, and that is the second part of the honesty dimension, is that you're credible, that you actually really want the European Union to enlarge, that you're preparing for future rounds of enlargement. And that's, I think, where we are currently severely suffering, because there is a credibility gap in terms of, on the one hand, giving the country, but also others, the perspective of joining the European Union, but then on the other hand, not actually seeing concrete steps or being willing to undergo concrete steps in terms to prepare the European Union for it. The argument being that we will do that once we get to that point where we will actually have to reform the European Union. And I think that this is something which doesn't make sense, but I'm sure we're going to come back to that later. And the last point when it comes to honesty is that there are some countries who actually would want, or some governments who, some leading politicians who probably would want to still avoid the EU from enlarging, who are still hoping, despite the promise given to countries in the Western Balkans, but also now to Ukraine, to Moldova, of having the ability to join and actually joining the EU at some point in the future. There are some who still hope and believe that this will not become a reality, because they believe that developments within Ukraine will create the preconditions for the country not being able to join, and that would then again derail us from the momentum which we have engaged in. And I think it's very interesting that Amanda made a link to Turkey here, because I'm often reminded of the 1990s when it comes to the current situation and debate we're having in some member states with respect to Ukraine and the debate we had on Turkey. And then when it became more of a potential reality, you saw that people were then openly saying that actually they don't really want the country to join the European Union. So that is a huge dimension of honesty, which is something that needs to be settled, because it is so important in terms of the geopolitics and also in terms of reforming the EU.
I want to delve in with Amanda in a moment to the detail of where we are in the process, particularly for Ukraine and Moldova, but also the prospects for Georgia and then wider to the Western Balkans. But Fabian, your analysis of that use of the word honest and why he chose that word in particular.
Well, as I said in my opening remarks, I think what is important is that we move from delivery. So whether we call that honest or whether we call that credible, but what we need is a process, a timetable, milestones. We need to have action about what kind of reforms are necessary, not only in the candidate countries, but also within the EU. We need to have a discussion around how we make sure that the geopolitical imperative with Ukraine doesn't push the other countries to the sidelines. All of this is something we should be discussing now. We should be putting on the table together with the candidate countries to get a credible, realistic, honest process. But I'm afraid that's not going to happen. I think what is going to happen is the worst of all worlds. It's a world where we make promises, which we have no intention of realistically keeping, where we end up in a situation where the process is uncertain, where the dissatisfaction, which we've already seen in the Western Balkans, will also start to infect other countries like Ukraine, like Moldova, and where we end up not being prepared when it then finally happens, because in the end it will have to happen. And then the wider repercussions are going to be even worse, with neither the EU nor the candidates being ready. I think it is rather sad that we can probably already foresee a moment like that, and still we are just going to go down that route, rather than actually having that honest debate now about what needs to be done.
Thank you. Amanda, Fabian there talking about his fear, promises we have no intention of keeping. Let's turn our attention first to Ukraine and Moldova in particular, but also to those prospects for Georgia. And then I want to come back to his point about whether, as he put it, the geopolitical imperative to focus on Ukraine means the countries of the Western Balkans get neglected and forgotten again. But in terms of Ukraine and Moldova, what is your reading now in terms of where they are in meeting the criteria for opening talks, and whether there's the appetite in the EU to at least start those talks anytime soon? I.e., is the momentum there, or do you fear that already we are seeing some backsliding?
I mean, I think both Ukraine and Moldova are doing well, and we need to remember they didn't start from scratch, because they were both implementing association agreements and trade agreements with the EU prior to getting the candidate country status. And within those agreements, it's many of the same criteria that accession countries have. So I think they're well on their way to meeting I mean, in Ukraine's case, it's 7 points, and in Moldova's, it's 9. I mean, Ukraine still has an issue around the issue of the Constitutional Court. There's a special independent commission, which is supposed to be composed of Ukrainian officials and independent experts that are given the task of selecting judges for the Constitutional Court. There's still a small issue around this. There's been some confusion over the Venice Commission's recommendations, because they didn't give a clear recommendation in the first place, which was criticized by civil society. But this is in the process. So I'm quite confident that Ukraine will be able to meet all of the points before the summer, or even after the summer. And let's recall that Ukraine's doing this against the backdrop of the war, which makes it extremely difficult. So I'm positive. I'm also positive in terms of Moldova. I mean, again, there's still some issues related to de-oligarchization and judicial reform. But again, Moldova is on the way. Perhaps the country lacks a bit of capacity, institutional capacity, to push things along quicker. But I do believe they will produce what they were asked to produce, because let's remember, this is a sort of once in a lifetime opportunity for both countries, because if it wasn't for Russia's full-scale invasion, neither one would have ever received candidate country status. It's something that Ukraine and Moldova have wanted for years, but they were always sort of, put off, or said that perhaps it's something that could happen, but now they have it. So I think they're doing they're moving in the right direction.
Yeah, they're doing their homework. On the EU side, do you think that will be reflected? Will we see the talks at least open by the end of the year, do you think, Amanda? Or do you detect some backsliding?
I mean, first of all, we have the oral assessment by the Commission in June. That will give us an indication, and then it moves to the autumn enlargement package. And I think there's a good chance that the Commission will recommend the opening of talks with Moldova and Ukraine. And if that's the conclusion, I think that it's an imperative that the EU actually open the accession talks, because not to do so would be, I mean, it would be very bad news, both for these countries, for the, let's say, for the reputation of the EU, first and foremost, but for the bigger geopolitical picture in the region. It's a necessity to do this, and it would be very wrong not to. So I think this is the moment to, to see the proof of the pudding is in the eating. They made a commitment already by giving candidate country status with the promise of opening accession talks once these conditions are met, and they absolutely have to do this, because the blowback from not doing it would be terrible.
Absolutely. Fabian, Janis, I'll come to you in a moment, but I just wanted to also pick up on the point that Fabian made earlier about his concern that, as he put it, the geopolitical imperative in terms of the war in Ukraine would risk that the countries of the Western Balkans, already very unhappy with how the EU is treating their progress towards membership, could be pushed further aside. Do you see that sign, or do you think there is a chance that we will see increased momentum for enlargement more broadly as a result of all of this? Amanda, just to follow up with you. Sorry, I caught you in mid.
Sorry, I thought you were talking to Fabian.
No, I just wanted to complete the picture in terms of all, then I'm going to come back to them.
I mean, to be honest, Jackie, I mean, 1 year ago, we did see a sort of renewed momentum for enlargement. This is how come, Albania and North Macedonia got the accession processes. I mean, the open talks, which was positive, but I mean, it was far too late, really. But whether or not this is going to continue into the future, I think the judge is still out on that. I personally think they absolutely need to follow through, to transform this commitment into concrete actions. But as was already mentioned, I do think there is a situation with some member states who are really not that keen on enlarging further. I'm not talking about the Western Balkans, but I'm talking about the eastern flank, the same countries that were never that supportive of Ukraine prior to the war in Ukraine. So there's going to be a need to do a very strong advocacy lobbying campaign by all relevant actors, Ukrainian civil society, government, and all of us that really support Ukraine, because this is really a geopolitical imperative. This is not just about Ukraine's stability and security and the future prosperity of the country. It's also about security and stability of the EU. And I think that European security requires the integration of the Eastern neighborhood plus the Western Balkans to achieve this long-term security and stability. No more gray zones, no more ambiguity.
Thank you. And I want to come back. There's a question from our audience about Turkey, so we'll come back to that in a little while. But in terms of that political will, for you, Fabian, do you believe, I mean, you talked about your fears, given the geopolitical imperative that Amanda was talking about, do you feel that among EU leaders that is recognized, and therefore that we will see what Amanda was appealing for at the beginning, that this really, the momentum that we have will be maintained, not just for Ukraine and Moldova, but also for the Western Balkans? Or do you think the politics, those countries that really are not keen at all, in the end, that the politics will just be too difficult, and therefore we will see backsliding and we won't see the honesty that we've talked about?
I think firstly, it is clear that EU member states have recognized that the world has changed. As we've already said, otherwise these countries would never have had candidate status. There's no way that could have happened, and that also involved some of the more skeptical countries, so we shouldn't forget that. But I think to translate that into reality is a very different question. And I think what Amanda was saying is right. These countries are making a lot of efforts. They're working very hard to meet the criteria. But we all know that, unfortunately, enlargement has not been just about the criteria. It's about the politics behind it. It's also not only about the readiness of the countries coming in, but also the readiness of the EU to actually absorb them. And in this particular case, there are many issues which we still have to address. I mean, just to give one example, the accession of Ukraine is going to have a huge impact on the EU budget. So how are we going to deal with that in the context of a much more difficult economic and security environment? But I think what we need to do, and that comes back to the honesty question, is if we think that Ukraine and Moldova need to do more, then we need to tell them. We need to be sure that they understand what the rules are for accession, and that that is a realistic process. Turkey has been mentioned. I still doubt that even if Turkey would fulfill all of the criteria, that it would become a member state, because there are underlying opposition to Turkey becoming a member state. And I think something similar is here in play as well. If you ask people behind closed doors, they very often refer to corruption. They refer to fears about Ukraine just being too far away, too poor, too difficult. They are referring to the conflict and saying if there's ongoing conflict, membership is not going to be possible, which in effect means saying that they are not going to become members anytime soon. So I think we really have to talk about what is a process which is realistic, And there, I think we need to work with Ukraine because there are real questions which need to be addressed. The question about security guarantees, for example, the question of how do we organize reconstruction? How do we ensure that there's a viable economy in Ukraine which can withstand the rigors of the single market? I mean, these are questions we should really be discussing, but not as a reason to stop them from coming in, but as a way of preparing their path into the European Union.
Indeed. Janis, your sense of the politics of this within the EU?
Unfortunately, you know, I remember in EPC updates very soon after the 24th of February that we were talking about the need that this is a geopolitical imperative. I fear that this is not being understood. I fear that many do not understand the gravity of the moment, that they're not having the will to push things forward. And I think the proof in the pudding will actually be on the EU side, whether the EU is ready and willing to reform itself, which means from an institutional governance perspective, from a budget perspective, from a policy perspective, it's a lot of different dimensions where the EU needs to, the EU27 need to prove that they're ready to move things forward, which, by the way, also, if you look into Scholz's speech, the elements he mentioned in terms of what needs to be reformed were rather short, but there's much more that needs to be done. And what I also see, and I'm being very frank here, is that there are unholy alliances, that there are forces in the European Union, that there are actors in the European Union who do not want the EU to enlarge, who do not want Ukraine to become a member of the European Union. And let's be frank, the war in Ukraine, and thus also the Ukraine case, is the major catalyst for the momentum, or for any kind of momentum when it comes to enlargement, that there are an unholy alliance between those who don't want the EU to enlarge, from their perspective, having arguments in favor of not the EU not enlarging, and you have others who fear that that the EU will not reform itself, and thus will the European project will suffer from an enlargement. So you create unholy alliances with very different reasonings, with very different interests, which come together, undermining the fact that it actually is a geopolitical imperative. And the last point I want to mention, what is being referred to when it comes to Ukraine is corruption, is the conflict, is the state of the economy. But there's even something worse, which shows you how ahistorical some of the discussions are. When you hear people, for example, saying, how can a country which is fighting for its flag, it's fighting for its sovereignty, I'm quoting, it's fighting for its right to be independent, it's fighting for its future and the future of future generations. How can a country of that sort actually surrender sovereignty? Because becoming a member of the European Union means that you have to surrender sovereignty. How ahistorical is this notion if you look back into the history of the European Union, if you go back to after 1945? That just tells you that there is still not a real understanding for how significant this moment is, how much of a geopolitical imperative enlargement is linked to the geopolitical future and the future of the EU in general.
Let me come to the question of Turkey, because, of course, we are in the midst of the elections. We had the first round. We have the second round coming up this weekend. I wanted to ask you, Amanda, in terms of the outcome of that election, if it is a win for Erdogan, but a narrow win, it looks like it could be a very narrow win, not clear yet, or indeed a win for the opposition. Would that make any difference, do you think, to the EU-Turkish relationships generally and the accession process? And I say Yürekli asked us in our audience, in light of Olaf Scholz's proposal for an enlarged and reformed EU with a more geopolitical outlet, and considering Turkey's significance in a multipolar world, how does the EU view Turkish accession as a litmus test for its honesty? He says, will the EU remain loyal to the principle of pacta sunt servanda if Turkey progresses towards a more democratic future as supported by the opposition? I'm going to leave it there as a longer question, but let's take that one. Could these elections make a real difference, do you think?
I mean, if President Erdogan is re-elected, I mean, I don't expect to see any real positive change in Turkey or Türkiye EU relations. Possibly they could even deteriorate depending on what happens domestically in the country and in some of Turkish foreign policy. But I don't think there's any real prospects for the sort of short-term issues that Turkey would like to see progress on. For example, upgrading the customs union, getting visa liberalization, restarting high-level dialogues on multiple issues, including foreign policy, which have been shut down now for, I think, the last couple of years since the escalation in and around the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean. That would be the situation, I think, with a President Erdogan reloaded, if I can put it that way. If Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu wins, then I think there is an opportunity for a new and positive opening in Türkiye-EU relations, definitely a revitalization, not perhaps in terms of the accession process, because I don't think, you know, we're at that point yet. As was mentioned before, there really needs to be the internal reform of the enlargement process to make it more fit for purpose. So I think it would be more likely they would focus on the upgrading of the customs union, the visa liberalization, and restarting high-level dialogue. But I mean, what would be very important would be for the EU to actually specifically underline that Turkey remains a candidate country, an accession country, that Turkey's future, as promised by the EU back in the day, is within the EU. This is something that's very important for Ankara. It's very important for the Turkish people. And also there's still high support for Turkish membership of the EU in Turkey. It's around 65 or 70%, which is significant. And the importance of the EU as an actor in Turkey is really important. You know, for civil society, the support that they get for their work is crucial. But I mean, in short, I don't see a real opportunity for an amazing change with Erdogan. But if the opposition comes in to a large extent, it's up to the EU itself to show, again, the necessary political will and readiness to deal with Turkey, a Turkey that is a much more important geopolitical actor, and not just in the region, but far beyond that.
Thank you very much. There's a question from John Palmer that links this discussion to our next discussion about internal reform. So Amanda, before I let you go, if I could ask you to address the first half of this question. John Palmer says, he wants to ask whether the EPC might commit to issuing a report which sets out some concrete target dates for the process of future enlargement, applicant by applicant by applicant. And the second part of this, linking to what we're going to talk about in more detail in a moment, it might also explicitly link this to a timetable for more profound internal reform and help to give greater political credibility to both processes. Is there any chance that the EU would do that, or do you think they would regard setting target dates by applicant as making themselves a hostage to fortune? Amanda, that part of the question, then I'll let you leave us because I know you have to go, and we'll come to the second part of it after that with Fabian and Janis. But on the enlargement, any prospect of a clear timetable?
I doubt it, but this is something that the aspirant countries have all asked for. I mean, they want more specifics, timelines and dates. But that is something that the EU just doesn't do for different reasons. I mean, if you give a sort of final date when accession is going to happen, or a date in between for some of our topical issue, it's highly unlikely that they would be met or there would be problems. So I think there will continue to be resistance to that sort of very detailed time frame. But I do think they could come up with something that's less vague than the current process, because many of the countries in the Western Balkans have said that the current process is very vague. There needs to be some sort of line, even if it's not that specific. So I do think there needs to be a change, and I would be very pleased for the EPC to sort of be part of this process, to come up with this sort of time frame for sure. But can I just say 2 words before I leave, one on Ukraine and one on Georgia, because we didn't mention
we haven't talked about Georgia, you're right.
It's really unfair. I mean, first of all, you mentioned corruption in Ukraine in the same sentence a few times, and I think well, you're not meaning that Ukraine was corrupt, but I think there's a perception, a very wrong perception in many circles in Europe, that Ukraine is the corruptest country in Europe. I've heard that phrase mentioned many, many times. And I think we need to dispel this because it's absolutely not true. I mean, long before, this ugly war began, Ukraine had taken serious measures to crack down on corruption, and this needs to be recognized. So I think it's very unfair when member states still, cite the issue of corruption as a reason for Ukraine not progressing, because this is just simply not true. Together with the government and civil society, they made a crucial
briefly,
step.
if you would, Amanda.
And the very last word on Georgia, I want to say that I strongly support Georgia remaining linked to Ukraine and Moldova. It's a mistake to take them apart and put them, as it's in a different part of the world, because they are. Georgia has always been very pro-EU, pro-NATO, and this process is important, not just for them, but for that entire region. So it's important that they stay together, linked together, and Georgia has done significant steps as well towards meeting the criteria to getting candidate country status. The biggest issue in Georgia is political polarization.
Gonna have to stop you right there because we need internal reform is equally complex debate. Amanda, always great to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us today. Fabian, just coming back to the second part of John Palmer's question, because you talked about credibility, we need a process, timetable and milestones, and you said that also in relation to internal EU reform. John Palmer was asking, you could link a timetable for enlargement, a concrete timetable, which Amanda thinks is unlikely, but link it to a timetable for more profound internal reform. In terms of that link between the two and the credibility of the two processes, do you believe that as you've all argued, it's so important, this internal reform debate is so much part of the enlargement debate, the old widening and deepening discussion? Is it providing momentum, do you think, for internal EU reform, or is the appetite just not there, and therefore the two constantly EU leaders are trying to decouple them constantly?
Well, I think we should look at this in the broader perspective. I think, yes, reform is necessary for enlargement, but we should recognize that reform is necessary for its own sake, because the European Union has to operate in a very different way in this new beyond the watershed world. And some of those reforms will then also help us with the enlargement process. But the process of reform should be starting. But we're now 15 months into the war. And I have to say that when it comes to these fundamental structural changes, it's rather disappointing. We've talked about it, but we haven't actually seen any real progress in terms of decision-making, for example, in terms of the way the European Union is organized. And I think what that comes back to is what I already was alluding to in terms of a strategic discussion. We should be discussing about what kind of union do we need to deliver the kind of goals which we have to deliver in this very changed and challenging world. And I think that very quickly then goes into some of the key areas where we need to see reforms. But do we see a timetable? Do we see a real discussion about it? I would argue we don't. And to some extent, I think this discussion about a convention, a big treaty change process is a distraction, because we all know that a process like that would take a very long time. It wouldn't be clear what the outcome would be. There are big differences between the member states. I think what we should be focusing on now is making rather practical changes in the short term, which can be implemented rather quickly. But I don't see any real progress when it comes to these fundamental reforms.
So on that point, Janis, Olaf Scholz mentioned two specific things. He welcomed the fact that the Parliament was working on institutional reforms. He mentioned particularly qualified majority decision-making on foreign policy and tax reforms. How significant was that? And do you think this marks a signal by Germany that it is willing to lead on this issue more than it has up until now since the Conference on the Future of Europe?
Just one point which came in the speech before the quotes you just mentioned, because he said Scholz said that enlargement, I'm quoting, should not be our sole reason for reform, but rather the arrival point of our reforms. And I think that's significant because it shows that, yes, you need, in order to enlarge, reforms, but you don't only need reforms because of enlargement. You also need it because you need a geopolitical reaction to the watershed moment of the 24th of February. And you need it in order for the EU to, in general, become more effective in future. And I think that's important to have that in mind. But when he was then referring to the European Parliament, which is working on proposals with respect to institutional reforms, he merely said that I will continue to promote the discussion of these ideas in the European Council. I will continue to promote the discussion. This is not about, putting all your political weight behind the necessity to reform the European Union because of enlargement and geopolitics. This sentence was not formulated this way by coincidence, because when there was opposition from a good number of countries, for those who remember, 13 signatories asking not to have a convention after the plea of the European Parliament, the reactions in Berlin were, and behind closed doors, and I know what I'm speaking about, was how can the Chancellor push for EU reforms when 13 countries are so much opposed against them? That exactly shows you that you're not ready to invest the political capital necessary in order to showcase that not only are you saying that we need to reform the European Union, but that you're putting all your leadership might into the equation in order to progress with respect to this process. So there is a discrepancy, and the speech is indicating that discrepancy. Also, the fact, and I'm trying to be more concrete now, to the 2 points that have been mentioned: Council decisions, majority on foreign policy and taxation. Yes, this is a good question to raise, whether this is important and might be on the list, but this is by no means everything we need to talk about. We were talking about earlier also the need for policy reforms, look at agricultural policy. What you can take out of this is that actually there is not the strong momentum to invest political capital and showcase the leadership needed in order to push things forward.
Indeed, Fabian, this reminds me a little bit of Emmanuel Macron after the conference on the future of Europe, when he said, we will take these proposals for discussion. Didn't make any commitment of any kind to actually do anything about them. Is your sense the same as Janis is here, that really this isn't, although he says, I will continue my efforts, it's efforts to promote the discussion, not efforts to actually do something? Are you as cynical about what he's saying here as Fabian is, or doubtful, I should say, rather than cynical?
I might be even more cynical or doubtful than Janis is, because I think what actually is underlying that, and you see that in these discussions over and over again, is that it's very easy to make these headline comments if you don't then have to deliver. The same thing we've already discussed with enlargement. It's much easier to say, yes, we give them candidate status, than to actually deliver what that means in terms of a process, etc. And what we are actually seeing is, in my view, that countries are unwilling, and I mean unwilling, not unable, unwilling to overcome their national taboos, their internal divisions. They do not want to have that discussion, and that means they will not go to the European level with a compromise, which also costs them. Because that is in reality what has to happen. Every country has to give up some of its taboos so that we can put something together at the European level. If I go to the German debate, for example, one of the big questions for the German political system will be who's paying for all this? And I mean all this in the broadest possible sense. Germany will have to bear a big burden in all of that. If we're talking about a renewed European budget, who's going to be the contributor to that? And what you hear from Germany is, well, we can't have that debate because the finance ministry, the finance minister is not going to do it. Now, if we just go to these national taboos, national barriers, nothing will happen. And I think this is realistically Unfortunately, the situation we're in, countries are not willing to overcome their national taboos. They're not willing to make a European compromise. They're not willing to really invest anything at the European level. And many times the European level is even forgotten. It doesn't even feature in the national debates.
Janis, you wanted to come back in.
Yes, there are two, I would call them fundamental notions regarding EU reform that need to be challenged. One notion is that, and the link between reform and enlargement and geopolitics. One notion is that once the pressure will be strong enough, we will reform the EU in order to prepare itself to enlarge, if need be, at that time. I think that's the wrong notion. I would rather say that the potential is high, that you would, assuming that there will be a big enlargement, that we will be moving again to 500 million citizens of the European Union, which is also mentioned in Scholz's speech, that in order to get there, the EU will probably need different rounds of reforming itself. I don't see that this as being one go. You have one moment where you have this big, even if you call it, which links to my second notion, a constitutional convention, you will change the EU and make it ready for enlargement. Even if you progress towards making the EU able to enlarge, fundamentally enlarge in the future, it will probably require different rounds, multiple rounds. Let's think back of Amsterdam, of Nice, of the Constitutional Treaty of Lisbon. All this happened before the Big Bang enlargement in 2004. It wasn't one go. So let's have that notion in mind. The second notion is the convention notion, where we always have in mind, and we have been discussing this also in the past, how the convention worked in 2002, 2003. With everything on the table, with the Laeken Declaration, with a lot of questions and issues being raised, but this was a fundamental attempt to fundamentally reform the European Union. Whereas we can think of the convention also in different terms, being much more concrete, with a much more concrete mandate, looking into concrete reform proposals. So we could construct it, if there is the political will to move in that direction, in a different way. So the old notions.
Do you think Olaf Scholz was so specific, as you said, it needs much more than qualified majority voting on foreign policy and tax reforms? But do you think by pinpointing those issues, he was trying to point to an approach which could be much more specific, rather than just broadly talking about the need for reform? Was he moving in that direction, and could that therefore be helpful?
I think if we would become more concrete, that would be helpful. The examples he mentioned in his speech, I think, were not chosen in order to showcase this is what we actually need, and then we will have solved the problems. Okay. Because it wouldn't be enough. There are more issues that need to be discussed. But the fact, and that also links us to, the upcoming EP elections in 2024 and what happens afterwards. He's referring to the fact that the European Parliament is working on proposals for constitutional reform, which it has to do because the European Council still has not responded to the call of the European Parliament right after the conference on the future of Europe for a convention, arguing we don't know exactly what you're talking about in terms of reform. But that's it. And I think this is important because it also indicates of what you need to do as next steps ahead and after the EP elections. Okay, so you need to become a, okay.
I want to come to the elections in a moment, but let me take two interlinked questions, which also link back to our enlargement conversation from our audience. Joachim Tissink says, given that this is a geopolitical imperative, would a multi-speed Europe be a better alternative than what he calls the worst of both worlds scenario of promising and not delivering? So is that something that needs to be discussed now? And Hege Naven says, is European political community a good alternative to EU membership? Slightly different than not so much a multi-speed Europe, but a Europe of concentric circles, as it were. Fabian, are these approaches part of the answer, and should these sorts of conversations be on the table when we talk about reform? Fairly briefly, if you would, because I'd like to come to the European elections before we close.
On the European political community, it's relatively simple. I think it's good to have a forum where leaders come together, but it's nothing like EU membership, and it will never be anything like EU membership. So this is not something which is an alternative. I'm not negative about it, but I just think it fulfills a very different function. On the question of multi-speed Europe, I think we have a multi-speed Europe already. And every enlargement process is actually a multi-speed process, because you have a lot of bespoke applications, waiting for certain laws to be applied, etc. Even in the process of becoming a member, there are steps along the way, which essentially are different graduations of becoming part of the European Union. But we should also not forget that there is a reason why countries like Ukraine have asked for membership. They have not asked for associate membership. They have not asked for an alliance. They have not asked to be part of the European Union sphere of influence. They've asked to be a member of the European Union because they understand what the political significance of that is. And I think this is something we shouldn't forget, that of course in many practical areas we will have to design the enlargement process for these different countries in different ways. But the end point has to be membership, because that's what they want, and that is also what Europe should want, because in the end we are talking about a community. And if we get away from this idea that countries who want to be part of the European Union will, maybe eventually, but they will become members, it's a very bad signal if we end up with those countries being put into the sidelines indefinitely. And just to add to that, that's exactly what we've seen with the Western Balkans, and you can see what happens within those countries if you put them off indefinitely.
Janis, a quick one, if you would.
Fabian was tackling on the external dimension of a more multi-speed Europe or differentiated integration. I want to tackle from the internal dimension. And if one would believe, as Fabian said, first of all, he's right, we already have different speeds. So differentiated integration is already a reality of today's EU. But if you think of the multiple speeds being the answer to some of the issues we've been discussing, being the silver bullet, I don't think that it is a silver bullet. Because if you look at it from an internal EU reform perspective, there's the notion behind that you have a group of countries which is actually ready to jump deeper into the level of integration among themselves, are ready to progress, whereas others are not. But if you look into realities, you will see that there is no such core, even if it's a bigger core, or rather big core, there is not that kind of a coherent group of countries who are ready to make that step, jump into the deep, not being able to do so because there are a number of countries who are not willing to do so. If that would be the case, it might be the solution, but the picture is much more blurred. So let's not fall into the trap of having a discussion which seems to be the solution, which actually, given the complexity of the situation, I fear is not. Although, again, multi-speed is a reality, and you will also need more differentiation in the future.
Thank you very much. Janis, I want to come back. You mentioned the European elections next year. There is some pressure, some arguing we need to make progress on this internal reform debate, set a process, set a timetable before the elections, because it'll be harder after the elections. Is your sense that the European elections are likely to make it harder, easier to get agreement? So is that political pressure to make progress before we get to that? Dates have now been set, 6th to 9th of June next year. What impact could they have?
I understand the argument of those who say that if we have the EP elections, we're going to have new institutions in place, including a new European Parliament, which its composition might look even more complex, and it might be more fragmented than the current composition looks like. You will have the new presidents of the Commission, of the European Parliament. So it might make it more difficult to immediately progress with respect to the EU reform debate because of all these institutional changes. And that's the argument which some are raising, arguing that thus there's a need to have a momentum before the EP elections. Now, we will see what the European Parliament will come forward with in terms of concrete proposals, and also in terms of its level of ambition when it comes to the next steps. But so that's going to be important to see how the EP will position itself. If it asks for a whole-scale convention, for something which is extremely ambitious, the reaction of the EU27 will be accordingly. If you're more concrete and if you come forward with exactly what you think needs to be reformed, it will be putting the EU27 under more pressure. The question is, how much of a political commitment can you get out of the European Council before the EP elections in terms of the process thereafter? And I think that should be the aim, to get from the European Council a reaction which says we've understood that's what you want, and that's the next step we will do and we are committing to do. So it needs to include concrete steps, not only nice words, in terms of continuing the process in order to have the political momentum right after the election.
Yeah, you set the parameters now, you set that process, and Fabian, you were calling earlier for that process, for those milestones, timetables to be set. Yeah. You set the process, Fabian, before the elections to minimize the risk that it's even harder afterwards. Do you see that as the way forward, Fabian?
I think it would be a way forward. It's not going to happen. And I think this is, unfortunately, I don't think that the European elections are going to be taken very seriously in the member states, despite, I think, a very high chance of them ending with a rather difficult outcome, if I can say it that way. But essentially, I think what we are going to see is a marginalization of the real debate around what needs to happen at the European level. I think this is much more about personalities. It's about Qatargate. It's about the overall dissatisfaction of some of the more fringe groups in the European Union, which will see this as a good vehicle to express the opposition to the war, to climate change action, etc. So unfortunately, I'm not very hopeful that this will be a constructive process.
Thank you. Janis, you wanted to come back in, and could you also say 2 words just on where we are, if we are anywhere, in the discussion on the process that will follow the elections for choosing the new heads of key EU institutions, most notably the question of the Spitzenkandidaten. Is it coming back? Will it be back? Will it be taken seriously or not?
Okay, so we have another hour. No, jokes aside.
You have 2 minutes to tell me where we are with
so
this.
give me 1 minute for the first part.
Sure.
I agree with Fabian that before the EP elections, the chance that the European Council will now wholeheartedly support the plea of the European Parliament to go forward with respect to having a massive process of EU reform, that the chances for that are rather low. So what I would advise the European Parliament to do, those in the European Parliament who are the key players in this debate, is to push the European Council to come up with a response to what they have been asking for. So if the European Parliament asks for A, B, C, D, E, what's your position? And to push the European Council before the EP elections to set in motion a process in order to get closer to the European Council being able to give a response to the European Parliament. If you remember, at some point we had said there should be a wise women's group with people who would be looking from the perspective, also on the basis of a mandate of the European Council, of EU reform to make things progressing. Okay. In order to do that, you have to think very carefully about this process, and I could talk for hours about that. Okay. And on the second part, the Spitzenkandidaten. Well, first of all, we never had one way of dealing with the Spitzenkandidaten process. We have had 2 experiences which were very different, and the third one, which is the one coming up in 2024, will again be very different. In 2014, you had the Juncker factor. You had someone who, if his party, the EPP, would have a relative majority, he would get a position. He became Commission president. Totally different situation in 2019, where we had all the struggle and we came up with the configuration as it now stands, which was delinked from the Spitzenkandidaten, because none of the Spitzenkandidaten actually became a president of one of the institutions or high rep. This time around, you have a different situation. You have potentially a commission president who will have support from the EPP, still with caveats and questions, that changes the equation. And it's someone who already is in office. So the Spitzenkandidat is there, it's still alive, but it is alive, changing dynamically every time around. We're getting into the 5-year circle. 14,
we will
19,
come back
25.
on this. We will come back on this, Fabian. We are out of time, but did you want to add 2 words on will it be revived? Should it be revived?
I think just to say, I think the parliament is facing a very, very difficult election. I think what we might actually see is that the parliament's role in Europe is going to be put into question if we have a very fragmented, a very difficult parliament, and that we are increasingly looking also at non-legislative decision-making as a key in the European Union. I hope I'm wrong. I hope the parliamentary election will turn out a lot better. But I think, again, and this is the whole theme, as we have already said, we should be asking these strategic questions. We should be asking the what-if questions. We should be working on building contingencies, because we live in a very challenging world, and at the moment, we're failing to prepare for it adequately.
Thank you. And that is something we try to focus on at Update. And we will come back to the question of the elections of the Spitzenkandidaten process, I'm sure, in many updates throughout the rest of this year and into next year. That is all we have time for. Just one thing to flag up to you on the publication front. Please do watch out if you haven't noticed already. The EPC has launched a new series of publications, twice weekly, what they are calling flash analysis. Short news items that respond to topical news and highlight the work of the EPC in key areas. The most recent ones have been on the G7 meeting and on the 11th package of EU sanctions on Russia. So do watch out for those. They'll be coming thick and fast into your inboxes. But gentlemen, and Amanda in absentia, thank you so much, as always, for being with us. Thank you to all of you for being with us. Thank you for your questions and comments. And we will be back with the next EPC update post-summit briefing after the June European Council. So thanks very much for joining us, and have a good rest of the day. Goodbye.
Bye, thanks.